Okay, before anything else. Hi, welcome back, seriously, glad you're here, grab whatever you're drinking, because we're not doing the slow wind-up today, we're going straight in. There's a specific kind of light on a car dashboard. It's usually orange, it's small, it says check engine, and it's the single most ignored warning system ever built into a machine, because the car still drives. It still gets you to work, it still turns on in the morning, so people tape over it or they just stop looking at that part of the dashboard, sometimes for years, and the engine keeps running just well enough that ignoring the light feels like a completely reasonable life choice, right up until it doesn't, right up until the transmission goes on the highway at rush hour, and suddenly everyone in the car is very interested in a warning light they'd trained themselves not to see. I bring this up because the United States government has spent the last year and a half running with a dashboard full of lights on, and the driver's approach has been to remove the dashboard. And I want to walk you through 4 completely different corners of American life, where that particular decision is now arriving in real time with a bill attached, because taken individually, these stories look like bad luck. Taken together, they look like a pattern, and patterns, unlike bad luck, are supposed to be predictable. Start in northeastern Minnesota, because this one is almost too clean as an example, which is usually when you should be suspicious of a story, except this one's been independently reported by half a dozen outlets at this point. So let's go. Back in 2024, the U.S. Forest Service had $10 million already approved, already planned, sitting there ready to thin out roughly 4,000 acres of dead and dry timber in the Superior National Forest. The kind of unglamorous maintenance work that doesn't make headlines because its entire purpose is to make sure nothing ever happens. A retired district ranger who spent 6 years running that district described the project as shovel-ready, meaning the paperwork was done, the plan was done, crews were basically standing there with the tools. Then, in early 2025, DOGE froze it for review. Not canceled, reviewed, which in federal government terms can sometimes be a distinction without much practical difference, because by the time the money was actually released, new rules had been bolted onto the project, requiring it to be redesigned around commercial timber sales, which is a very different kind of project than clear the brush before it burns. Meanwhile, the Forest Service itself had lost somewhere around 100 employees in Minnesota alone, part of a nationwide reduction that gutted staff who manage exactly this kind of grant. So, the fuel-thinning work that was supposed to create a fire break along a road called the Echo Trail never really got moving, and this July, more than 60,000 acres of the Boundary Waters started burning, not near the Echo Trail, along it. A congresswoman from the district actually stood up in a hearing this month and told the Forest Service chief to his face that the agency diverted its own forest management money to pay severance packages for the people being pushed out the door, which, if you want a single sentence that captures the entire operating philosophy of this administration, you could do a lot worse than, we fired the people who prevent the fire, using the money meant to prevent the fire. Now, layer number 2, and this one's got a smell to it, literally. There is currently a cyclospora outbreak spreading across 41 states. Cyclospora is a parasite. It causes weeks of miserable gastrointestinal illness. And as of late July, there were over 4,000 lab-confirmed cases, with another 7,400 suspected, tied at least partly to contaminated lettuce that's already been recalled. Here's the part that should bother you more than the lettuce. For decades, there was a joint surveillance system, CDC, FDA, USDA, state health departments, actively hunting for exactly this kind of outbreak before it became a 41-state problem. Some of that surveillance capacity, specifically a program called FoodNet, got cut. When asked about it directly, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told a reporter, and I'm going to get this close to exact because it's worth hearing in his own words, that there were, quote, no cuts to the surveillance program, only cuts to what he called redundant surveillance, which is a fascinating use of the word redundant because the entire logic of a surveillance system is redundancy. You want overlapping eyes on the food supply. That's not waste, that's the whole design. Telling the country the backup cameras were unnecessary right before the car backs into something is not usually how you'd want that sentence remembered. Investigators, for what it's worth, still haven't nailed down all the sources of the outbreak, and some public health researchers have said plainly that the staffing and funding cuts likely slowed down exactly the kind of interviews and lab work that finds contamination fast. Kennedy says it's under control. The case count says it's still climbing. Which brings us naturally to measles, because why stop at one preventable disease? The United States just recorded the highest annual measles total in 35 years. Over 2,300 confirmed cases, the worst count since a resurgence back in 1991, and the overwhelming majority of those infections, something like 93%, are in people who were unvaccinated. Now, in fairness, and I want to be fair here because the honest version of this story is more interesting than the simple version, and vaccination rates had already started sliding years before Kennedy took the job. So this isn't a crisis that was invented from nothing in 2025. But what has changed since he took over Health and Human Services is that the person in charge of restoring public confidence in vaccines has spent his career actively undermining it, suggesting vitamin A as a meaningful response to a disease vaccines already prevent, and by multiple accounts stepping back from the day-to-day running of his own department, while outbreaks in South Carolina and Texas grew into the largest the country has seen in decades. There is no actual treatment for measles once someone gets it. There's only prevention, and the person whose entire job is prevention appears to have opinions about prevention that prevention doesn't really survive contact with. Fourth stop, and this one has body counts attached, so let's slow down. Since February, the United States has been in a shooting war with Iran, and the Pentagon has had what can only charitably be described as a complicated relationship with its own casualty numbers. In 1 week alone this July, the official death toll on the Defense Department's public tracking system dropped from 18 down to 14, and the wounded count fell by dozens, which the Pentagon blamed on a data disruption. Democratic senators sent a letter asking, reasonably, what exactly disrupts data in the specific direction of making a war look less costly. Within days, the numbers were back up, restored, not corrected, restored, and by month's end, the department's own database showed 18 dead and somewhere north of 600 wounded, some of those wounds relabeled into a separate accounting category called overseas operations that conveniently sits apart from the war's official name. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly why a specific number moved on a specific database on a specific Thursday. Nobody outside that building fully does, and that is precisely the point being made by the 12 senators who wrote that letter. Ewi ipop desperspike. The public is not supposed to have to guess whether the casualty count of an active war is accurate. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, for his part, told 60 Minutes back in March that Americans should expect more casualties, that seeing bodies come home stiffens the country's resolve rather than weakening it, which is a genuinely bold thing to say about other people's children from a podium in a war whose own official numbers keep mysteriously getting smaller right up until public pressure makes them mysteriously get bigger again. Now, here's where I'll do something the last few minutes probably haven't prepared you for, and tell you a version of this story where the light on the dashboard actually got fixed. For the better part of a year, a coalition of church groups, city councils, and ordinary depositors ran a slow, unglamorous campaign against Citizens Bank, a mid-size regional lender out of Rhode Island, because Citizens had roughly $2.5 billion in financing tied up with Core Civic and GEO Group, the two companies that run a huge share of America's immigration detention system. It started small. Faith groups pulled a few million. Then a city pulled $200 million. Then, this July, just 3 days after the town of Montclair, New Jersey voted to pull $91 million out of the bank. Citizens announced it was ending its lending relationships with both prison companies entirely. Citizens, in the finest tradition of corporate statements everywhere, called this a business decision unrelated to the protests, citing changed commercial circumstances, which is true in one very specific sense, since the federal government itself has started buying up some of these detention facilities directly, reducing how much outside capital the prison operators actually need. But the organizers who spent a year showing up at shareholder meetings and standing outside branches in January cold aren't particularly interested in litigating Citizens' internal motivations. They got the outcome. The bank isn't in that business anymore. Nobody at Citizens is going to put months of relentless public pressure in a press release, but you don't actually need the confession to know what happened here. So, here's what I think connects a burning national forest, a lettuce recall, a vaccine-preventable disease at a 35-year high, and a war with a casualty count that keeps changing depending on who's watching that week. In every single one of those stories, somebody made a decision to stop measuring something, or stop maintaining something, or stop staffing something, on the theory that the thing being measured, maintained, or staffed was probably fine without it. And in every single one of those stories, it wasn't. The dashboard light doesn't cause the problem. It just tells you the problem exists before it becomes the only thing anyone's talking about. Rip it out. And the check engine light stops bothering you right up until the engine does. The Citizens Bank story is the one exception in today's list. And it's only an exception because enough people refuse to accept that the light couldn't be turned back on. Everywhere else, the light's still off, the fires are still burning, the lettuce is still getting recalled, and the casualty count is still doing whatever it's doing this week. Make of that what you will. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. If today made you want the next one before it's out, subscribe, because we're just getting started. And I promise you the dashboard's got more lights on it than we even got to.